All right, I think I might get started with the webinar. Thank you everybody for attending today to listen to three inspiring people discuss this important topic of queer identities across Asia, celebrating Pride in 2023. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all dialing in from today. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respects to elders past and present and to all First Nations peoples whose land we will discuss today in this webinar. I just wanted to say a friendly reminder that this webinar is a safe space for people to express themselves and their ideas. Please send through any comments or questions during the webinar and they'll be addressed during the Q&A at the end. But please ensure that all questions are kind and respectful because this video will be recorded and posted on the Asialink website. The intention behind the webinar is to expand the reach of important conversations and raise awareness about the topics discussed and elevate the voices of our three inspiring panelists today. If you do ask a question but you don't want it to be recorded, please send me through an email and we'll edit that section of the recording to make sure that this is a safe space for all. So please just reach out if at any time you think that something shouldn't be posted online. At Asialink, we want to ensure that everyone feels comfortable and safe as possible, so we'll adapt our work to meet the needs so that you can contribute to this discussion as well. It's really important for us. As I mentioned, please submit questions throughout the webinar and we'll be answering them at the end of the question. I'm sure that we won't get to all of your amazing questions today, but if we miss yours, we will reach out to you and respond to them individually. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. James is a research officer and group facilitator at Monash University and Alfred Health in Victoria, Australia. James is a passionate program events development and marketing manager with extensive experience in the multicultural community, arts and culture, tourism, adult learning, and the LGBTQIA+ sectors. Brenda teaches in the Gender Studies program of the University of Hong Kong. She has always been among the most visible queer activists in Hong Kong and the Philippines, and has appeared on TV and radio. Her research work and publications are mostly on exploring the trans identities using interdisciplinary approaches. She was on the executive board of the ILGA Asia and currently the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines. And Hendri is an Indonesian writer, author of Intimate Assemblages, The Politics of Queer Identities and Sexualities in Indonesia, and co-editor of Queer Southeast Asia. He writes about gender, sexuality, popular culture, and sustainability for a mainstream audience in Indonesia. His writings have been published in the Jakarta Post, Indonesia at Melbourne, and many others. He has also published a poetry collection and co-edited a queer speculative short stories collection. Now I'll hand over to James.
Thank you very much, Grace. So my name is James Seow, and I use to pronounce him. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm participating in this webinar, and that will be the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So I'm currently with Monash University, and I am actually a part of the HIV network that works to reduce HIV transmission in overseas born populations, paying special attention to LGBTIQ communities. Before I begin, I would really like, so as Grace has so eloquently sort of introduced today's agenda for the webinar, and we'll be really between Brenda, Hendri, and myself, we will be discussing some of the queer trends, communities, rights, and some of the changes that are happening across Asia and how that somewhat relate to what's happening in Australia and what perhaps the three of us, based on our lived experiences and our observations in our respective countries, we would be able to share some of our insights and some of our wishes and what we hope to see happen within our communities across Asia and what we can do to sort of strengthen our relationship with Australia as well, in particular the queer communities. So before I go further, I would just like to introduce my two fellow panelists, and that would be Brenda and Hendri. And perhaps I would like to invite Hendri to perhaps introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your experience and what you do. Brenda?
Thank you, James. mabuhay, as we usually say in the Philippines. And I also would like to acknowledge our trans and queer ancestors, past, present, and future. Actually, for some people might wonder what's behind me. Actually, this is a portion of this mural painting by Botong Francisco, national artist of the Philippines, and this celebrates the traditional healing culture of our babaylans. The babaylans are our pre-colonial trans queer people and women. Yeah, and I will always be very proud of that part of our culture. So I'm from the Philippines, as I mentioned. I was born and I was raised in the Philippines, which is quite a Christian and in a way quite conservative society, although it is also a bit tolerant of LGBTQI cultures, but still no absent. Still no this anti-discrimination laws. I'll talk about that later on. But I am currently in Hong Kong. I've been in Hong Kong for 12 years. I'm a lecturer at the university where I teach gender studies. And I'm also doing advocacy work. As Grace mentioned earlier, I was part of ILGA Asia for 3 years, and I was also part of ILGA World. And the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines has been around for almost 21 years now. So we do like support group for trans women in the Philippines. And I'm able to do that virtually, or not unless I'm in the Philippines. And at the same time, we also do advocacy work for trans people in the Philippines. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Henry, over to you.
Thank you, James. And before I introduce myself, I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking today. And what we will highlight in this discussion is actually a small gesture to connect queer movements and also decolonialization movement, in which we shouldn't separate our movements, because being together means that we also highlight the intersectionality of social movements and struggles that we've been part of it together. So I'm Hendri Yulius Wijaya, and I'm coming from Indonesia. So I have also lived in different countries like Singapore and also Australia before. And I studied gender studies and I did my research on LGBTIQ politics in Indonesia during the hostile period
Mhm,
between 2016 to 2018.
mhm,
And then after I completed my master's, then I published my thesis entitled Intimate Assemblages, the Politics of Queer Identities and Sexualities in Indonesia. While while I was completing my studies as well, I also managed a gay Asian Health Survey in Sydney, working together with the AIDS Council of New South Wales, or
mhm.
ACON. So that's a little bit of background of my professional experience, and I hope that today we can discuss about that kind of connection between different countries and Australia, and we can look at how queer movements can build solidarity across different countries. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Henry. So to all the guests who are joining us today, I just want to say that in preparation for today's webinar, I actually had a private chat with both Brenda and Henry, and it was quite an insightful phone chat, and I just want to sort of frame it that way because as I was speaking to Brenda and Henry, we all come from different parts of Asia, and also we have different connections to the LGBTIQ communities in understanding, researching, and supporting queer communities across Asia. And I realized that as I heard both Henry and Brenda shared their experience with me in preparation for today's webinar, there were nuggets of wisdom along the way, and I hope that we would be able to explore and share some of these insights and observations and nuggets of wisdom with our guests. So first of all, I would just like to kick off the one of the major developments in Asia, and that is the decriminalization of consensual sex between two males in Singapore. Now, that was a very recent development. It only happened like in the last few months. And so I was actually wondering whether, based on what you see in Singapore, because just a few months ago, I was taking part in another community event where I was invited to share some of the insights, when it comes to being like an advocate, for the LGBTIQ communities. And so I was comparing what happened in Singapore recently, which is this change, in the decriminalization of consensual male sex, and comparing to what happened in Australia, because I believe that South Australia was the first state in the whole of Australia to decriminalize consensual sex between two males. That was back in 1970s, and fast forward almost 50 years later, and Singapore sort of did the same thing. So that was a significant move in the Singapore context. And I would really love to hear, perhaps, let's go to Brenda first, and what are your thoughts and how this might sort of influence or create like a new milestone or signal something new that is emerging around Asia, particularly where you live, Brenda?
Thank you, James. Actually, when the news, of course, we were getting some what we call spoilers or feelers that this is going to happen. And one of the reasons for that is because of the advocacy work, the groundwork that has been taking some time. The amount of advocacy, that people like you are doing on the ground, and of course the kind of partnerships, from the other LGBTQI organizations in different parts of the region, are probably contributing in the conversation. Especially when I was with ILGA Asia, and of course these are things that we are actually monitoring, from that regional perspective. On the very good end, I'm hoping that this will have good ripple effects, not just in Southeast Asia, but in the rest of Asia, in the Pacific. Especially like if we look at some countries in Asia, there are still many countries in Asia that, if not criminalizes, romantic and sexual affiliations, between same sexes or same genders, there are also absent equality or marriage equality or union laws, right? I could speak for that in the Philippines and in Hong Kong. So we still, in Hong Kong, the only thing that they recognize is if you are, let's say, you had the union in another country. So now, because of the more recent decision, they can recognize, your overseas union. There was that landmark case, of that. Of a couple, who had their union recognized in the United Kingdom, but it wasn't recognized in Hong Kong initially, so they fought for that recognition. But still, there is no equality union or marriage here in Hong Kong. But then, because of the decriminalization situation in Singapore, plus the equality union prior in Taiwan, hopefully that will actually inspire not just Hong Kong, but the surrounding countries, right, to also do the same. But on the downside, what we still have to fight for would also be on gender identities, because let's just say that in terms of being a same-sex couple, if you are cisgender, it might be easier. But if you are non-binary, if you are queer, gender fluid, and most if you're trans, then it might still be very challenging, because you may be in a in precarious situations. So I think that's something to also talk about.
Brenda, you have actually reminded me one comment that I heard at a conference that I attended here several years ago. Even within the LGBTIQA plus community, it is a very huge and diverse community, right? People that belong or who identify with each letter of the acronym, right? Because it is such a huge community. The rights and also the kind of privileges that are accorded to each letter in that acronym is also not equal, right? So
yes.
Yeah, so you have reminded me of that, and I just want to highlight that in our discussion here. You have also mentioned marriage equality, which does not exist in Hong Kong yet, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also within the Australia context, it's also a very recent development is like less than 10 years, right? So it's quite a new, compared to the UK, to the US, that sort of thing. Yeah. But
I mean, like if we imagine, if we look at history, the marriage equality unions all started after the millennium or at the turn of the millennium. Like the Netherlands started with that in 2001, I think, and then followed by Spain, 2006. Yeah, so everything is quite modern. And to think that that's the reason why we're trying to marry what is modern and what is has always been, you know. So it's I'm also here to remind our audience that we have always been around, you know. Queer people, LGBTQI people have always been around in different names, you know, with different cultural realities.
When it comes to queer rights, they need to be considered in a larger context, right, of other equity, inclusion, diversity considerations as well. Would you like to share with us what some of these larger considerations might be?
Okay, so I think the first larger consideration is about how we can try to protect the democracy of Indonesia. Because as you can see, right, this new criminal code can jeopardize the civil liberties and also our private space. And of course, we need to protect the private space and also the civil liberties rights, right, in the democratic regime. So that's the larger consideration that I would think of this time, how actually queer struggles should be connected with how we want, how we will protect the country's democratic regime. And then second is when we talk about the larger consideration, we also talk about our solidarity with women's movement, for example, because as I said, right, this criminal code also will affect women and also will affect heterosexual people who might be involved in any kinds of extramarital relationship or sex outside of wedlock, right? So everyone can be impacted, not only queer people. So this is what we, again, I want to highlight what we need to do together to build solidarity across different identities at this very difficult moment.
Right. So who do you think, say, the first and foremost stakeholder that we should look up to, or perhaps some of the partners that you think we should be looking at? What are some of these perhaps top one or two stakeholders that you think our community can consider approaching and talking to?
I think if we look back at the history of queer movements in Indonesia, usually we are very close with the women's movements, because the women's movements are also defending the rights of gender diverse people, and the women's movements also already have a long standing history of advocacy and movements in the country. And this is where actually queer movements can strengthen their relationship with the women's movement. And I've always seen that the women's movement and the queer movements are always together, especially during the hard times, because the women's movements always support queer movements, mostly. So that's the low-hanging fruit that I think we could start with at this difficult moment.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Hendri. I want to go back to Brenda now. And I know that, Brenda, you are now living in Hong Kong. You have lived in the Philippines, and I'm not sure whether you have lived in other countries as well. And I'm very curious to really understand, you know, what have been your different experiences in the countries that you have lived?
Thank you. So I moved here in 2011, and so I've lived in the Philippines for most of my. I'm not revealing my age. I'm not revealing my age. Yeah.
No embarrassment. No embarrassment.
Yeah, it's okay. So unfortunately, up until now, even when I moved here in Hong Kong, there have been no change in terms of equality union and gender identity. Maybe for equality union, the closer the semblance, you know, to something quite close to that is the one that the decision for the Angus Long case, you know, here in Hong Kong, right? The overseas union recognition. That's the only difference. But in terms of gender identity, there is at least some steps forward for Hong Kong, whereas we still don't experience that in the Philippines. So on the legal level, the Philippines is much behind, on many areas. Like equality union is absent, gender recognition is absent, and anti-discrimination is absent. So when I was still living in the Philippines, the anti-discrimination ordinance has been discussed, for many times, and it's being blocked by the conservative and forces, and many of which are representing the church, or at least the semblance of the church, right? And citing that being LGBT is a sin, that it is a lifestyle that doesn't deserve any further recognition and protection. Unfortunately, it's been around for 23 years now. The anti-discrimination ordinance has already changed its name. It's now known as the SOGI or SOGI Equality Bill. And there are very few staunch defenders of that who we could really clearly identify as allies of the community. But recently, the SOGI Equality or SOGI Equality Bill is in the news again because it's being debated again on the legislation sector, and the legislators, many of which are identifying themselves as Christians, if not Catholics, are still saying that they're delaying, the progress of the law, or of the bill rather, or the ordinance. In the Philippines, however, we do have what we call pocket anti-discrimination bills, which means that in certain parts of the Philippines, like Quezon City, in a few parts of the Greater Manila area, in some parts of the provinces like Cebu or Davao or Bacolod, we have what we call anti-discrimination ordinances on the city level or municipal level. So these are just pocket levels of anti-discrimination. Maybe that's different with Hong Kong because there is an anti-discrimination ordinance in Hong Kong. But even if there is an anti-discrimination ordinance in Hong Kong, there could be gray areas in the interpretation of anti-discrimination here in Hong Kong. And the lack of the visibility of LGBTQI, particularly trans, non-binary, and queer identities, can make it very difficult. So, there have been many narratives of trans people or queer, non-binary people experiencing, if not just subtle discrimination by non-verbal cues, from other people, outright prohibition of using, let's say, binary spaces, because the spaces are binary here. Even in the Philippines, most of the spaces are binary. Although there have been quite a little progress, particularly on a corporate level, because some of the companies that champion DEI, or diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion, some of them have successfully installed gender-neutral spaces, such as toilets. In most other public spaces in Hong Kong, it's still binary. So it's quite challenging, especially if it's like a public pool, resorts, where changing rooms and toilets can be quite challenging for trans people. So if we move forward, gender identity, that is gender recognition that is absent in the Philippines. I could still say that at least trans people in the Philippines can freely go about different places without being scrutinized, for their appearance. So at least for, if not all the time, for the most part. We will only be challenged on a legal basis, So if we experience discrimination in the workplace, a trans woman will have a hard time proving the discrimination because of the absence of anti-discrimination law or the social equality. She will also have a hard time defending herself because of the absence of gender recognition. In terms of Hong Kong, that can be slightly different because a trans person can invoke the anti-discrimination ordinance, or the recent victories of transgender people in the courts. So we had the W case victory in 2013 or 2014, whereby a trans woman under the code name or alias of W fought for her right to marry her partner in that gender she identified herself as. So she identifies as a woman, her partner is a man, but her gender marker in her passport and her Hong Kong ID is male. So eventually after her transition, because she is a post-op trans woman, as we say in the older language, post-op transsexual, and then also heterosexual, in terms of having a male partner, and she identifies as a woman. So she got recognized for that in 2013. But then that means that the court were requiring, here in Hong Kong, the courts were requiring not just the certification from a psychiatrist that you are a trans woman or a trans person, but it requires coercive medical procedures, like sterilization, phalloplasty, metoidioplasty for transgender men, and then, other gender affirming surgeries for trans women. So, and of course, a lot of trans people are against that and are unhappy about that and would not want that, because being transgender is not always about transitioning. A lot of transgender people in different societies do not really transition, so to speak, or do not want to fully transition, if there's such a thing. So going back to Hong Kong, there's this recent court case, the Q Se case, the Q and Se. So there are two transgender men identifying people. One of them is hidden with the alias of Q, and the other is Henry Se. So he came public about his case. So in February, I think February 6th, and sometime last week or almost over a week ago, the court allowed them to change their gender markers on their Hong Kong ID without the requirement of transitioning or doing the coercive sterilization and metoidioplasty or phalloplasty. So that could be a potential step forward, for a greater gender recognition here in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Brenda, you have brought this issue of religion earlier in your sharing, and I find it very insightful, because it sort of reminds me of what has been happening in Singapore as well. I mean, Singapore has no, Pride March, nothing. However, Singapore has a event called the Pink Dot campaign. So basically, it is a group of LGBTIQ individuals and the allies and the families coming together to show support of the freedom to love. So it has been going on for like more than 10 years now, and throughout that 10 years there's always been this tension between the more conservative religious communities and what the Pink Dot community and the organizers and the allies are trying to achieve. So there is always this tension, and even after consensual sex between two men has been decriminalized in Singapore, I could also, what I've been observing is that there is still that tension, right? Which is still happening. And I'm wondering whether this is something that you notice in the Philippines and in Hong Kong as well.
Yeah. The tension, it's not just let's say on a psychological level, sometimes you could sense tension, right? Non-verbal, if it's non-verbal or even verbal, but it can also be very blatant, like when we do have Pride events in the Philippines and in Hong Kong, the Pride events have kind of halted for some time because of COVID restrictions or maybe a few other related restrictions. But in the Philippines, the Philippines have had ongoing Pride marches, and whenever I have attended many of those, and it's always going to happen that there are religious fundamentalists, as we say, who would bear placards such as, you go to hell, you will burn in hell if you don't change, if you don't embrace Christ, etc., etc. So most of these voices are actually coming from the Christian groups, whatever specific Christian groups they may represent. Most of which maybe Catholics, and the thing is, a lot of LGBTQI Filipinos are still practicing as Christians, and when we have, let's say, get-togethers, or we will have webinars or sessions, even casual conversations, we feel that you could be a Christian and LGBTQ. And the thing is, that's also another reason for us to keep talking about our pre-colonial realities, because we have always been around. We are in our pre-colonial times, until before Spain conquered the Philippines in 1521. LGBTQI people and women are actually existing in a more matriarchal society. So if we look at the world, in general, most of the societies could be referred to as, let's say, if not most, maybe many, as patriarchal. The Philippines in its pre-colonial years were really more of matriarchal, So that's why LGBTQ people, women are healers, leaders, councils, and even warriors back in the day. But because of religion, because of the colonization, so colonization has changed that. And eventually they brought Christianity. Christianization has changed that, has definitely contributed to the oppression of LGBTQI people. If we do comparative studies, it may have happened as well in other societies. And I could say that in India, in South Asia in general, that has happened, you know, like hijras are like what we can consider as trans women in India. They have been recognized historically for thousands of years. They're in the text, you know, and they're feared and respected at the same time. But because of British colonization for almost 200 years, more or less, that has diminished the reverence of the hijras. And they were forced to mendicancy, they're forced to sex work, you know, they have been, you know, they live quite threatened lives, you know, in the streets of India, but still they are revered, they're still acknowledged. And it was not until 2015 that India has acknowledged trans people or third gender people on a legal basis. But still India doesn't have equality union laws, you know. So it's kind of murky here and there, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then going back to the Philippines, we may not have all of those laws, but there is this kind of vibrant culture that if you're an outsider, you go to Manila or somewhere in the Philippines, you'd feel that LGBTQI people seem to be accepted, but we're not really accepted. We're just tolerated. Maybe similar in the experience in Thailand, you know. To the rest of the world, they feel that Thailand manufactures trans women, you know, and that it even promotes trans tourism, you know, to globally. But they don't have gender recognition law in Thailand. They also don't have equality union laws in Thailand, you know, and their anti-discrimination laws is more of on gender expression, less of gender identity.
Got it.
And then if we look at their religious practice, they're not colonized, so they're not a colonial society, but they seem to have like a colonial culture, you know, if you talk about that. And Buddhism actually looks at transness or being LGBT as like a karma. So they feel that let's have pity or mercy on LGBTQI people. They're living the karma of their prior lives, you know. So and that can also be like something to think about, you know, culturally. Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. I want to move on to Hendri, and I know that you have lived in Indonesia, you have lived in Australia, and I just want to hear your points of view. Like, have you noticed any cultural differences, you know, in the queer identities? You know, what have you observed?
Thank you, James. So I think I would like to begin by highlighting that when we are talking about identities, especially queer identities, we also need to take into account that we inhabit many identities within our own selves. So our identity is not only gender identity or sexual identity, but also our ethnicity, our race, and also our ability or disability identities can overlap with our gender and sexual identities. So when I was in the beginning to move to Australia, I was thinking that as a Western country, Australia was almost like a gay paradise, whereby I would be accepted, fully accepted. I could celebrate my own identity. I could party every night without anyone would bothering me. However, when I arrived in Sydney, I just realized that although my sexual orientation might not be a problem, but my race or ethnicity affects the way I live in this country and the way I could perceive myself as a queer person. What I mean with how I could perceive myself as a queer person is all about belonging. Because we need to recognize that in Australia, most of, maybe many gay communities are white dominant. So sometimes it's very difficult for me to feel a belonging to that kind of gay community or queer community. And this can be also very challenging as a migrant living in. And then the second point that I want to highlight is I think we need also to admit that there is a certain level of sexual racism, even
Mm,
racism among or within gay communities or queer communities. And this can also, make a migrant's experience can be quite debilitating. And also, when I finally realized the situation, then suddenly I thought that, oh, wow. So Australia or Western countries are not always a gay paradise. But
mm,
when I moved here, uh, one thing that now becomes a problem is my race, ethnicity, and migration status or citizenship status that can,
mm,
debilitate my daily life, for example, or can be very challenging for me as a queer person.
mm,
So that's why when I realized this, then I felt that I needed to find an Asian queer communities or gay
mm,
communities. And luckily, I found that kind of community, a very close knit gay Asian community where I could get support from them. And that's where I began to work with ACON and did a gay Asian man health
mm,
survey in Sydney. And I think this is also very important to highlight because, there is this program, Gay Asian Man Health Survey in Sydney,
mm,
means that um, there is particular attention paid to gay Asian man community here. Maybe because of lack of access to health, or maybe some other language problem, or some other problem like racism that affect the way uh, they live and inhabit their sexual health, for
yep,
example. This, this is an evidence, I think, about the importance to look at queer politics and queer communities more closely, and also
mm,
connect uh, the issues not only to sexuality and gender issues as well, but
mm.
also to broader issues of race, ethnicity, migration, and also disability.
Yeah. Hendry, I think what you said about that cultural influence is so important because in my work at the Victorian HIV network that's led by Monash University, and so we will work with the Department of Health, the Burnett Institute, Melbourne Sexual Health Centre, Thorne Harbour Health, and so on, as well as Alfred Hospital, to really reduce HIV transmission in overseas small populations, right? Paying special attention to gay, bisexual, and queer men. And so what I found out from that is that this kind of cultural impact, the family that you grew up with, that kind of upbringing, and even that influence from religion in that culture has a certain impact on the way that you view your own sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and how you negotiate safer sex as well. So all this is, so it sort of reminds me of this issue of intersectionality, right? And so I remember many years ago, there is this Western cultural encouragement to really encourage, if you identify as LGBTIQA+, there is this pressure to come out because you have to be true to yourself, right? And so I remember there was this gentleman who told me several years ago, and then he said, okay, come out to where? Is it a safer place? So if we choose to come out either as trans, bisexual, gay, or lesbian, right? Are we coming out to a safer place first? So that sort of got me thinking, yes, while people who identify as LGBTIQA+, they are encouraged to be true to themselves. There is no shame in it. However, in the process of coming out, one also has to ask oneself, are we coming out to a safer place, right? So you have also brought up this thing about this power imbalance as well, right? Because as a racial minority, there is this impact of racism. So I sort of shared this example once at an anti-racism forum recently, if, let's say, just imagine you have got a gay couple, okay, two men. You have got an Asian man and you have got a white man in Australia, yeah? if they go out to eat at a restaurant, when it comes to paying the bill, who do you think the waiter will pass the bill to? It's very interesting. If we ask ourselves that question, and what do you think we are most likely to witness in such a scenario? Sort of makes one think about that kind of power and privilege that exists for queer individuals who are not white, but are living in a predominantly white place, right? So so I found it really, really fascinating. Thank you so much, Hendri. So I want to go back to Brenda, and I'm just wondering, you know, with like this World Pride going on, and how do you think Asia and Australia can participate in organizations like in ILGA? Is there something that Australia can do?
I think a lot of advocates and LGBTQI leaders in Australia have been doing a lot of great things for quite some time already. There is in ILGA, ILGA has a different substructures actually. So we have ILGA Asia, but we also have ILGA Australia and New Zealand. I forgot how it's called as a collective. So, but there is a particular region for New Zealand and Australia. And in fact, the ones that invite me to actually come to Sydney as a speaker are a lot of members of the Equality Australia, and also other advocates or activists from LGBTQ communities in Australia. So I think what we have to keep doing is collaborating, working together, and sharing best practices, just like what Asialink is doing today, you know. So we're able to share our experiences, you know, from the ground, our narratives, and because like Hendri, you and I serve also as the conduits or amplifiers of the voices of our communities, and we witness, you know, for many years, you know, what has been going on. It's not just about reading, but being part of the shifting of the cultures, you know, and our voices then become quite helpful in that manner, you know. So when we occupy this space, it feels like an opportunity for us to share the collective knowledge, the collective experience, the good and the bad, you know. So and I think we'll just keep doing that. So hopefully there will be more opportunities, you know, like for Australian LGBTQI groups to keep looking for unrepresented voices. I'm pretty sure that there are migrants, you know, from Indonesia, from Singapore, from the Philippines, from Malaysia, who are living in Australia, you know. And hopefully the news will become good. You know, I remember some years ago, you know, like of a trans woman who has had a very violent experience with an Australian partner a few years back, and then also trans women in the Philippines who are among the undocumented refugees, you know, and they're hiding, you know, because they're afraid that they couldn't get jobs, they didn't have university diplomas, etc., and they feel that and they couldn't also change their gender markers on their passports because they still carried with them Philippine passports, so they decided to remain undocumented. And at least Australia is a safer society in general. It could have been worse if it happened in other parts of the world, you know, where there is violence perpetrated day to day against LGBTQI people, even in our own backyards. You know, even in the Philippines, you know, violence towards LGBT, very specifically trans women happens. You know, every now and then. We had this. We had what we call a poster child of trans violence. That's Jennifer Laude. She was murdered in the Philippines, you know, by an American soldier, Mike Pemberton, in 2014. And then in terms of, we watched as justice was being practiced, you know, right in front of our very eyes, and we didn't really receive full justice. Even our former president, Rodrigo Duterte, who himself has earned a bad reputation as a human rights violator, has also pardoned the murderer of Jennifer Laude. So maybe, you know, through Asialink and through our partners in Australia, when they hear these news about what's going on in our communities, they can probably contribute also some, you know, whether it's knowledge or knowledge exchange, you know, through trainings, through workshops, you know. There could just be many potential partnerships that can definitely give a lot of good returns, you know, for these communities in different parts of Asia and the Pacific.
Right. So I want to hear, Hendri, how do you think perhaps Australia can play a greater role in what's happening in Indonesia? I think that's quite an interesting development there. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so Australia is positioned uniquely as a Western country, right?
Mm,
It is a Western country, but also it is in a very close proximity with the Southeast Asia region. So,
mm,
of course, the developments of queer rights in Australia can be considered as something outlier, right, in the Southeast Asian region.
mm,
But at the same time, I think this opens up more opportunities for collaborations between academics and queer activists in Australia and also the broader Southeast Asia region. One
mm,
thing that we can do and form a collaboration together is through knowledge exchange. I think that's one thing that I've been thinking about
mm,
recently after we published an edited collection entitled Queer Southeast Asia. We just realized that activism needs to be supported by knowledge and research, right? And this kind of knowledge support can be facilitated by a lot of Australian university institutions because usually when we talk about queer rights, queer theory, we usually always look to the US. But
mm,
now, because of the closer proximity between Australia and the South and Southeast Asia region, I think we can try to divert that focus by looking at the relationship between Australia and Southeast Asia region and how these two regions, right, can form an academic collaboration or knowledge or research collaboration together
mm,
because of this closer proximity. And then the second thing that I've been thinking about is, of course, it is related to queer refugee issues. We know that in some countries in Southeast Asia, queer people can have a very challenging life situation to the point that they might need to leave the country, right, as a
mm,
refugee themselves. And I think here refugee issues also should be highlighted in Australia, queer refugees issues. And when we talk about queer people, right, we also talk about our queer refugee friends and
mm,
people who are suffering, right, and that need to come to a safer place in Australia, for example.
mm,
So this is the second point that I want to highlight. And
mm,
then maybe the last point that I want to highlight is I think we need to be brave and courageous enough to talk uncomfortable stuff in our activism and
mm,
scholarship. Because, when we are talking about racism, actually, we are talking about uncomfortable stuff that often we deny it
mm,
exists in our queer communities. So I
mm,
think we need to really be uh, generous in admitting that uncomfortableness does or discomfort does exist in
mm.
our communities, and we need to talk about it because, as you have mentioned, James, our LGBTIQ people, right, in this acronym have different struggles, different
Yes,
among each other, right? And
yes,
different privileges attached to different identities.
correct.
So I think
Yeah.
we need to talk about discomfort and uncomfortable things at the moment
Mm.
because this is my last sentence. Of course, I won't be too long because when we talk about queer movements, right, we don't want to disconnect gender and
Mm.
issues from a broader consideration of race, ethnicity, migration, and disability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hendri and Brenda. Oh, you have given me so much food for thought. I think I will have to mull over some of what you said, some of your observations, insights, and your perspectives, just so valuable. And what I'm also hearing is that there's a lot more work to be done when it comes to rights, identity, and supporting and encouraging affirmative, like identity affirmative practices across the region. There's so much work to be done, and certainly I think there needs to be sort of braver and more courageous and bolder discussions in the public domain, and held respectfully, of course, for intercultural understanding to happen. And when I mention culture, I don't necessarily mean ethnicity or race, because culture to me is the collective opinions, beliefs, values, lived experiences, and attitudes of different groups of people. And even within the LGBTIQA plus community, it is so diverse. It's so important for different groups within the community to really understand one another and to build allies, relationships, right? So it's not just from outside the community, but also from within the LGBTIQA plus community as well. So much more work to be done, but I think that, you know, hopefully with some of the developments that are happening within Australia, across Asia, we could see, I would love to see some significant change happening so that, you know, there is greater inclusion, diversity, equity across the region. Yeah, thank you so much. And over to you, Grace. Thank you for waiting for us patiently to finish our conversations. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Brenda, Hendri, and James, for such an amazing conversation. You're right, James, it's a lot of food for thought, and I'm really excited and hope that this is the first of many conversations that we all have together about this. So we're a bit short of time. We've got about 6 minutes left, and I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 questions. So I might ask you all to try to stick to about 2 minutes per question. Firstly, I'll go to Hendri. This is for you. It's from Liz from the Hume City Council in Victoria, Australia. She says, it's great to hear that queer and women's rights can support each other in Indonesia. As you're no doubt aware, notable Western women academics and certain fantasy authors are very vocal in their criticism of trans people and communities. What do you think are the reasons for greater solidarity between these groups in Indonesia?
Thank you, Grace and Liz, for the question. So, to my observation, in Indonesia, the mainstream women's movements do not really exercise the trans exclusionary perspective so far. And from my observation as well, I could see that both groups are supporting each other. So maybe what makes it possible in Indonesia, because we have quote unquote the same enemy, like conservatism, right, that affect both groups altogether. And also the second thing is that we have a long history of transgender identities, like for example, the Waria identity or Wanita Pria identity, and also other types of gender diverse identities in the country. So it is always seen, I mean, trans identities for women's movements are always seen that they are already part of the nation state culture. So it's not, and then that what makes both groups can collaborate together. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Hendri. Brenda, I might pass this next question over to you. It's from an anonymous participant. They say that the Australian trans community struggles to avoid the influence of the attacks against trans people in the US and the UK. Are Asian countries experiencing the same influences?
It is possible, but I cannot really yet correlate, you know, if there is like a direct influence. Like I mentioned earlier, the debate on the equality, the SOGI equality or anti-discrimination bill, and that has been happening for the past, like last month. It happened last month, and I am not sure that if that debate was triggered by what is happening in the US in particular, the anti-trans and anti-LGBT, anti-drag, anti-trans laws that have been passed in the US quite recently. So it is possible that that's being impacted. But what I could remember is in 2016, I experienced also personally discrimination here in Hong Kong, you know, for using a public toilet. And it was around that time that there were toilet debates that was happening also in the US. And so we couldn't help but feel that there could be, an influence, a negative influence of what is happening in the West, in some of the countries that actually look to the West, for any amounts of progress, in their laws or in their culture. So that's what I'm scared of. Like personally, even I'm afraid to go to the US or to the UK because of the anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ events that have been happening that can actually potentially bring about violence, especially that my passport or my documents are not transitioned, so to speak. But I look forward to going to Australia and New Zealand. And also I look forward to going to Singapore. I haven't been to Singapore actually. Yeah. And Taiwan.
Maybe it's
Amazing.
time, Brenda. Maybe it's time.
I think it is time.
Amazing. Thank you, Brenda. I might pass this over to you, James. Of course, acknowledging that we have a few people here that have joined us from across the world in other sort of Western countries, I guess you would say. And we've had quite a few requests from the US and Canada to send recordings because of the time difference. So William Armour has sent this through. So he asks, what is the role of queer communities in non-Asian countries? So this means, should the struggles that have been spoken about be solved solely by Asians, or can outsiders assist in the struggles that are faced by, in brackets, all queer communities?
Definitely not by the Asian communities alone. I think I think the question relates to Asian communities living in outside of non-Asian countries, right? So obviously, I presume that they would be a racial minority. And as mentioned just now by Hendri and myself, we need to consider this issue of intersectionality. So everything else influences everything else. There is this interplay of forces when it comes to power, privilege, being a racial minority. So if, let's say, I say something, the weight that it carries is very different from someone else of a different race in that country saying exactly the same thing. So when we walk into a space, we carry different levels of power and privilege, depending on what is being discussed, what is being encouraged or sort of championed, advocated, that sort of thing. So I think we need to be very aware of the power that we hold in that place. So certainly it's not. So I've always believed in building strong allies and having, like what Hendri said just now, improving spaces and opportunities, creating more opportunities for public discourse and having that respectful space for intercultural understanding, either through conversations, forums, panel discussions like this, or something else, to really help us to understand people who are different from us, and how can we sort of help, how can we understand them better? Because I think that is one way to build empathy. I think that is very important. So I do a lot of work in the intercultural space. And what I've always been interested in is really to build that intercultural understanding, strengthening empathy, so that we can sort of grow together. We can all progress together. There is no point in certain segments of a community going so far ahead and then leaving others behind, because yeah, that's not an equitable place to live in, right? So yeah.
Thank you, James. I think that is such a great note to end on. You know, coming from working in my organization with Asialink, we work to strengthen understanding and trust between countries of Asia and Australia. And so I think that's a really good note to end on as we potentially discuss the next opportunity to expand on that thought. So I just want to thank you, James, again, and Brenda and Hendri for your fantastic participation in today's webinar. We've really valued everything that you've said, and I'm sure all of the participants today and all those listening to the recording have learned a lot from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for
Thank you,
joining.
Brenda. Thank you,
Thank
Hendri.
you,
See you
Grace.
soon.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Brenda. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.